look at how long it takes just to get the approval to start building a house in Canada. Anywhere from a year and a half to almost 3 years on average in some of Canada's biggest cities. Politicians of all stripes from all levels of government seem to agree that holdup is a huge part of why we are where we are today.
We need to build more homes faster.
Faster.
And faster than ever before.
We have young people living on the streets.
Pleading for housing options that are within reach.
It's a supply and demand issue.
If we do not build more housing, this will get worse.
But the federal government says it has a solution, one that worked 80 years ago when it helped build tens of thousands of houses really fast and really cheap. But how realistic is that today? Will reviving Canada's so-called wartime housing plan actually speed up builds? In most cities, if you're trying to build a house, there are two separate but related hoops that you need to jump through. One is to follow the local zoning rules, which I'll get to in a moment. But two is to get a building permit. Now, to get that permit, you generally need to commission and submit a portfolio of structural drawings. These need to outline things like fire safety, plumbing systems, construction materials, and usually they need to be stamped by licensed architects and engineers. All of that takes time.
And then if there's any challenge around a design or around a project, that can delay it even further. So the timelines of these projects are a significant issue.
And keep in mind, this isn't just for major projects like condo buildings. Even for laneway houses or secondary suites, you have to go through all of this. So the government says, let's revive a really old idea to cut down on red tape.
We're essentially trying to unclog the pipeline at every step of the way.
In the early 1940s, there was a housing crisis in Canada, not entirely dissimilar to today.
They were short a couple 100,000 homes in Canada. Like, people were doubling up, they were living with other families with the same problems that they had back then. There was no way to build housing that quickly in the kind of normal system.
And so in 1941, the government set up a crown corporation called Wartime Housing Limited.
Architects and draftsmen went ahead with the job of designing inexpensive homes of non-essential materials that could be erected almost overnight by mass production.
They prepared thousands of identical blueprints and shipped them to builders across the country, cookie-cutter houses. And a lot of the time, you know how long it took to build one of these homes? Like months, maybe weeks? No, 36 hours. They called them strawberry box homes or victory houses. You can still find tens of thousands of them across the country. So fast forward to today, and the government is saying, maybe we could do that again. Let's make a similar pre-approved catalog of designs to cut down on all the time and money spent procuring, reviewing, and amending these drawings. Forget having to go through the same red tape on every project. Maybe a big chunk of what we build only needs to get approval once.
We'll be looking for pre-approved designs for multiplexes, for mid-rise buildings, for student housing, for seniors' residences, and other small to medium-scale residential properties. This will include garden suites and laneway homes and different kinds of houses that will solve the challenges that our communities are facing today.
It kind of makes sense. And I mean, it worked before, right? But it doesn't quite address another part of the approval process, and it's a big one. In reality, even if you have an approved blueprint, you can't just kind of plop it down anywhere you want. Like, a skyscraper in Calgary doesn't necessarily work in Canmore, right? And Toronto's Yellow Belt is a good example of how zoning laws really limit what you can build where. For decades, these big yellow swaths of the map have been zoned strictly for single detached or semi-detached homes. Same thing in this map of Vancouver. Most of the land here has also been zoned for single families. Now, recently, both cities loosened those rules a bit, making it easier to build things like duplexes or triplexes in those areas. But to build anything else, you'd need either public consultations or actual changes to the bylaws, which can be a lengthy and expensive process. And the bigger the project, the more rules apply.
There are many studies that are required for a project, and in particular larger multi-unit residential buildings, everything ranging from engineering and architecture to shadow studies, tree canopy studies, runoff studies, traffic studies. It can be extensive.
Zoning rules also often specify things like parking requirements, how close you can build to the sidewalk or to other buildings, how tall your building can be, what kinds of shadows you can cast.
And then there's also neighbors. And if neighbors have opposition to your project, then that can also take significant amount of time.
Basically, lots of cities have lots of different constraints. And that just wasn't an issue the last time this idea of standardized blueprints really took off. The most significant building regulations in the 1940s were basically about mitigating fire risk. Public consultations weren't a thing. Toronto's first zoning bylaw wasn't passed until 1952, and Ontario didn't have a province-wide building code until 1970.
There's still a lot of work to be done at the municipal level to make sure that those building types would be pre-approved.
But here's the other thing. Even if you get the blueprint approved, even if you follow zoning laws, doesn't necessarily mean that house is getting built. Moving from approval to action also seems to be a huge part of this problem. A 2023 City of Toronto report puts it this way: an ongoing challenge is translating development application approvals into completed homes that individuals and families can move into. From 2017 to 2021, Toronto City Council approved an average of around 30,000 units per year. The average number of units built over the same 5 years? Only about 16,000. Across Ontario, there are apparently more than 1 million potential new homes that have been approved, but where construction simply hasn't yet started.
The developer has a profit target, and so the project has to meet that profit target before they'll proceed with it.
Yes, no matter where you live, money is a big reason these projects get stalled. A lot can change for a developer, from plans on paper to shovels in the ground. The market can change, financing can fall through, even the cost to build can change from year to year.
An unprecedented surge in demand has sent prices here soaring.
Just look at the Building Construction Price Index. The cost of building a single detached house or townhouse in Halifax, for example, has gone up nearly 10% since this time last year. This varies a little city to city, but in almost every city where this is measured, the rise in costs has outpaced inflation. Getting the skilled people to actually do the building is another hurdle. According to Stats Canada, there are almost 100,000 vacant jobs in the construction industry across the country.
Canada's construction industry is dealing with a labor shortage, and it looks like it's going to get worse.
We're talking about a shortage of residential and high-rise construction workers, bricklayers, cement finishers, people who do trim and tile work.
It's the old adage that time is money. Delays in construction projects really can add significant cost to a project and turn projects that were at one point financially viable into projects that are teetering on the brink.
All this means the incentives to build right now are limited. And for developers, until we know what blueprints are approved, it's impossible to know whether they'll even think they're worth building.
Really, these projects are on a razor's edge here in terms of whether they will make their financial viability targets. And in many cases now, costs have run up so much between the interest rates and the construction costs that the end buyer or renter can't afford what it would cost to actually move into that unit.
So here's the bottom line. We haven't heard any experts say this is a bad idea. I mean, more options for faster builds. That's a good thing. But details matter. Which blueprints get this wartime pre-approval? And how willing will municipalities be to incorporate them into their neighborhoods? Will builders actually build enough of these homes at scale to put a dent in Canada's housing crisis? Hard to say. A consultation process on the whole thing starts next month, and the government says it'll likely be almost a year until any new design is ready to be built.